final word for introducing this course is tourism. Now, I never wanted to study tourism, to be honest. Well, that's not entirely true. As my career went on, I eventually did get really interested in tourism, but that wasn't like ever supposed to be my main focus. I got interested in anthropology, in large part because I found religions of the world fascinating. I'm a total religion nerd, as anybody can tell you. All forms of spirituality and religion and the supernatural, I just find them fascinating. I'm also a total environment nerd, thus the land part of land culture and tourism kind of makes sense, right? I love to think about and study how human beings relate to their environment. Tourism was not in the game plan, but as probably a lot of you know, our life does not always follow the game plan. My first project was in theory about Navajo sacred mountains, but it ended up considering as a kind of the driving force of that, the effects of a ski resort, aka a form of recreational tourism, upon a sacred mountain, right? So, and then also kind of situating the activist movement that was resisting that ski resort within sort of a broader context of a quote unquote tourist town, as it's sometimes thought of, Flagstaff, Arizona. So that project ended up having a lot of tourism in it, even if what I thought I was doing was studying how religion and environment affect each other for Navajo people. A later project that I studied much more recently had to do and has to do with Latter-day Saint, or as it's more popularly known, Mormon, sacred sites within upstate New York, specifically the historic sites associated with the founding of the religion. And I was kind of started getting interested in that because I was curious about, among other things, sort of, again, how religion and environment affect each other, but this time in a very different culture. But it ended up having a lot to do with tourism as well, because the main people who visit that site are tourists, broadly conceived, historic site tourists, religious site tourists, although usually going there to have a religious experience. And so tourism is one of those things that keeps creeping into my research, even if it's not really what I fully intend to be studying. And so now I'm going to force it on you. Right now, you have to find tourism interesting too. Now, you don't actually have to, but I would like to make a case in this video that tourism is more interesting than you might think. It's actually really, really interesting. Even if you're not a huge tourist yourself, as you might gather, professors aren't typically loaded with the cash. We just aren't. So I don't do nearly as much traveling of the world as I'd like to. And if you looked at my passport, you'd be rather underwhelmed by how few countries I've visited. I am proud to say that I've traveled a lot within the United States, partly in some pretty beaten down old car that I had that I drove all over the place as a college person. But as far as like thinking of myself as a regular tourist, I don't know if that would be the right way to describe me. I don't typically have the money for that or the free time, given that we have small children. And yet I find tourism fascinating, and I hope you will too. So partly though, if we're going to find it fascinating and really explore it as a fascinating part of human existence, we have to partly broaden what we mean by tourist. So with that in mind, I want you to think, what do you think of when you think of the word tourist? What does it make you think of? Does it make you think of people taking selfies in front of historic buildings and generally making a nuisance of themselves? Does it make you think of these two people that are clearly doing a photo shoot for some kind of magazine, but looking at some map, pointing obviously somewhere, and they're about to get pickpocketed because they're so obviously tourists? Does it make you think of the tourists that come and visit us in Alaska and help enrich our local economy, and that some of our towns, like Soldotna and Kenai, are somewhat dependent on? Or does it make you think of perhaps if you're a hunter or fisher, the person that you've taken out to show them how to hunt or fish? That's a type of tourism as well. This is me when I first got to the Kenai River area, and I went out with some river guides to learn how to fly fish, because I'd done a lot of fishing, but not fly fishing. My point is, that's sometimes what we think of as tourists. And by the way, there's sometimes class and racial dimensions to how we think of a tourist. You may notice, for example, a lack of apparent racial diversity within the pictures I took, and that's somewhat intentional. And partly I tried to use examples that, whether or not they are literally from the States, would look like sort of white people from the United States, because that sometimes is the model that we think of with tourists and the way that gets presented in TV commercials and TV programs. But of course, tourism, and sometimes to take that even further, not just sort of a racial or a certain country dimension, we sometimes think of tourism as meaning something that a highly privileged class of people do, people with a lot of money. I think this is one of those people that I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's an Emirates flight where you can it's like $20,000 for a first class seat. I don't know how that would ever be worth it. I saw a TikTok video or something that my wife sent me about these, not because she wanted to go, she thought it was ridiculous, but wow, how ridiculous to spend $20,000 on that. How many hungry people could you have fed? But that's a story for another day. I'm not here to tell people how to spend their money, other than to send it to me. But my point is, we sometimes think of tourism in those terms. And if we're not thinking of sort of a wealthy American, perhaps we are thinking of wealthy people from certain other sort of first world, quote unquote, or global north countries. And, that kind of, if we think of tourism that way, it kind of fits in nicely with the kind of convenient history of tourism that we sometimes get told. If you go, for example, oops, is this going to work? Yes. If you go, for example, to this website, this funded by the EU, by the group Europeana, Tourism for Pleasure, a brief history of tourism. This was one of the first sites that Google pulled up when I asked for a history of tourism. And basically they made the case, we can trace the origin of the modern concept of tourism back to the 17th century, when young nobles from Western and Northern European countries made what was called the Grand Tour, a trip around Europe, usually covering France, Germany, Italy, and Greece, with the main purpose of soaking up history, art, and cultural heritage. It was considered a perfect way to be educated. By the 18th century, this custom was widespread among wealthier classes, and it spread to other parts of the world, such as America. And yet they note at the start, people have always had a need to travel. So it's kind of a funny contradiction. And you find that in like Wikipedia pages and other kind, like the Britannica entry for history of tourism. They'll oftentimes be like, oh, well, tourism has lots of roots, but also like tourism starts in the 17th century or 18th century. And what they're talking about is something called the Grand Tour. Okay, so sorry about that. I was attending to my kiddo. So as I was saying, one way of telling the history of tourism is to think of it in those terms as something that grows out of an enormous amount of privilege, and specifically out of Western and Northern Europe, something called the Grand Tour that was in the sort of 17th, 18th centuries, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and where nobles and just kind of otherwise well-situated people, especially in England, but other places as well, would travel through France, travel through Germany, see the continent, as Europe is sometimes called by the British, go and eventually go into places like Greece. And it was sort of, the idea was, see Western heritage, quote unquote, AKA Greco-Roman heritage, which was often thought of as sort of the foundation of sort of European culture and sort of that specific cultural tradition. And, indeed, Greco-Roman tradition did profoundly influence the course of Europe and has led to many modern innovations that are very, very popular in the world today. But anyways, that would be a very specific kind of tourism, to see a specific part of the world. And the idea is, oh, that was a thing. And then, traveling for the sake of travel, traveling for the sake of seeing things, sort of the beginning of sightseeing tourism. And then it spread to other groups of people. And then, the Americans had lots of highways, so it led to highway tourism, and bada bing, bada boom, bada bing. That is one kind of history you could tell of tourism. However, as our friend Abraham Lincoln here suggests, you cannot trust everything you read on the internet, right? This is not the only way to tell the history of tourism. And especially if we can broaden our definition a little bit, and there's really no reason not to include traveling, period, right? Because there's no reason to think that the kind of traveling they were doing in Europe in the 1700s is sort of the only route that has led into what we now think of as tourism, right? People travel all around the world for all sorts of different reasons, many of whom have only a tangential at best connection, if any, to sort of the history of Europe in the 1700s. So yes, that has influenced tourism across the world and is a big major force leading into it. But tourism, as we know it, is affected by many different routes, partly because traveling, as the first sentence of that internet site suggested before they went off into a left turn. Anyways, traveling is very much a human behavior that humans have always done. We sometimes have this idea of sort of hunter-gatherer people and cultures as isolated. And that's really not true for many of these groups. We could just share one example since we do happen to be in Dena'ina country. For Dena'ina people, traditionally before sort of that country got colonized, um, it was very common for folks to live in one village. Let's say, for example, the area that we now think of as Kenai, or the area that we call Tyonik, or the village of Nick, or the village of Eklutna. It was common to live in a village like that and then travel perhaps all the way across Cook Inlet or Tikanu to another village that might be, hundreds of miles away, dozens, if not hundreds of miles away. And that was normal and natural. People would do that, for example, oftentimes to share news, sometimes sad news, somebody had died, sometimes other kinds of news, but they would go to other villages and travel, especially during the winter when traveling was easier because of, frozen lakes and things like that. So you could not have to do as much as zigging and zagging around bodies of water, and you could travel over them. So traveling during the winter was not uncommon for people. Now you might say, well, but that's not tourism, that's people traveling for a practical purpose. Now, it's not traveling just to travel, but I would suggest that traveling is never just to travel. I think if you think about why you travel, right, or why any of us travel, or why the people travel that were taking those selfies in that picture, right? The fact that they were posting selfies, a way of sort of getting social capital, potentially a way of sort of posting that on social media, and perhaps especially if you're an influencer or something, getting more follows, getting more likes, that suggests that travel is more than just literally going to a place to go to a place. We go there to learn something. We go there because it's fascinating. We go there because we think I need to be in the sun, right, and get some vitamin D. There's all sorts of reasons we travel that are not just traveling to travel. So if we think of it from that point of view of tourism more generally is just humans traveling places, other than just to hunt something, then, we could say that humans have been traveling the whole time. We've been tourists all along. When people would visit other villages, they would come and share news. They would often spend, in Dena'ina country traditionally, they would often spend days hunting with each other. But also oftentimes they would spend days, it would be like a time of celebration. Somebody comes from another village and you do like dances and songs for days, just kind of like hang out with each other and do some songs. Might be sacred, might more just be for enjoyment, I'm not sure, but just kind of a time of connecting, right? So humans have always been traveling. We could go all the way back to 500 CE or AD, and talk about, for example, Japanese onsen. I think that's the correct pronunciation, but these are hot springs that traditionally in Japanese society were thought to have healing properties. Many people still visit onsen, tend to be associated especially with healing for women, but also healing for all people. Originally, that was kind of more of an elite thing, but over time, especially in the 1800s, that kind of led to popularity across Japan, really, or maybe even a little earlier than that. Partly there's a lot of hot springs there because of the fact that Japan is basically located at the intersections of the Eurasia Plate, Philippine Sea Plate, and Pacific Plate, which we're on the opposite end of. So anyways, lots of hot springs activity there. So people go to these onsens, right? They were tourist locations. They're, buildings that people set up that you could come and stay at while you attended these hot springs. And as can be seen in this famous woodblock series, 7 Hot Springs of Hakone. And as far as we know, it probably even goes back further than 500. That's just the earliest record we have of it, because by then you have people writing it down in Japanese writings from that period as if it were already a thing. Like, went to the onsen today, it was great. My body feels super refreshed. And we could go back even further though than 500 CE, and we could shift our focus from Japan over to the ancient Near East, to the Southwest Asia, what's sometimes called the Middle East, specifically to the land of Palestine/Israel, Jerusalem. Right, people have been taking pilgrimage to Jerusalem since at least 300 CE, which is when we have some of our earliest records of sort of the desert mystics, which you can learn about in my Abrahamic religions class. But anyways, the desert mystic Christians visiting Jerusalem and writing about it, right? And some of the early bishops writing about that. And of course, that's continued throughout the centuries. People from Eastern and Western Europe traveling to Jerusalem to sort of experience the places where Jesus lived and taught and died. And even then, right, we might say that depending on how you want to think of it, pilgrimage travel to Jerusalem has been going on a lot longer than that, because you went up to Jerusalem. It was slightly higher elevation. You went up to Jerusalem if you were an ancient Israelite living in, let's say, 300 BC. You went up to Jerusalem to do sacrifices and to visit the temple. So, right, if we think of pilgrimage as a route of tradition, tourism and travel, and we really should, humans have been traveling all the time for that reason. Sorry about that. So pilgrimage has been going on, for centuries. And of course, we could talk about pilgrimage to Mecca, right? Since at least 700 CE. Actually, pilgrimage goes on a lot longer than that to Mecca. There was already pilgrimages to Mecca, which is part of what Muhammad was, and his followers were. Kind of what makes that interesting is there was already pilgrimages to Mecca associated with some of the polytheist religions in the area. But then after that, of course, the Muslim Hajj, right? One of the 5 pillars of Islam, where Muslims, if they're physically and financially able, travel all the way to Mecca from far corners of the planet and take part in a huge joint ritual. People wear the clothes of Abraham, these white clothes that symbolize equality between each other, engage in a variety of different kinds of rituals, circumambulate the Kaaba, or the black rock at the center of Mecca. That is said to be colored black, partly because people have touched it so many times and deposited sins there. So this is a beautiful, complex tradition that's been going on for centuries, right? Well, we could go back even further than pilgrimage to Jerusalem or pilgrimage to Mecca. We could talk, for example, about the Greek. I'm not sure how to pronounce this word, but in Greek it means sights, or as we've translated that in modern English, the 7 wonders of the world. So you've probably heard the phrase before, the 7 wonders of the world, and it gets applied to a lot of different sites now. But the term originally comes from this list of sites that Greek writers, Greek poets, other just kind of slightly more elite Greeks would go and visit around sort of their immediate world, the Mediterranean world, basically. So they included things like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They included things like notable large statues of gods. They included things like the pyramids of Giza, right? So they were considered the 7 wonders of the world. All but the pyramids have now been destroyed or otherwise sort of aren't a thing anymore, unfortunately. But this was very much an example of people traveling, writing about it, wanting to see these things, writing down their list, and other people wanting to see those same things, right? So even if we're talking about tourism just as, quote, traveling to sightsee, that's been going on way longer than the Europeans in the 1700s. It's been going on at least since 100 BC with the Greeks, and lots of other examples we could share from other parts of the world. All of this to suggest, and I could have shared 100 other examples if I had gone into it, but all of this to suggest that to travel is to be human. We are sometimes, we are called Homo sapiens, and a lot of people have riffed on that and defined like other kinds of terms like Homo economicus, right, the economic man, or Homo hierarchicus, right, humans as hierarchical beings. I want to introduce a term I made up, and it is not proper Latin. The second word, I made it up, but anyways, Homo touristians, or the traveling humans, right? We have always been traveling beings. That's part of our heritage as humans. That is not a new thing. Tourism in the broadest sense of traveling to see other parts of the world and to engage with them is something we've always been doing. As I try to symbolize here, with this Neanderthal right by the Tower of Pisa, doing a selfie, just as this guy's doing on the other picture. Of course, the Leaning Tower of Pisa didn't exist in Neanderthal times. And also, of course, there's a really terrible, not even Photoshop. I didn't even use Photoshop. I used literally copy and paste and cropping. So I've done my obligatory graphic design is my passion meme, which I will often do when I know that a slide that I've done is particularly ugly and terrible. So I apologize for this slide, but it's to make the point that we've always been traveling. Which all of those examples, I think, ranging from pilgrimage to trying to connect with quote unquote Western styles of heritage, even though they're Western, but also kind of affect Eastern as well. And also things like those going to a hot springs to get healing, right? Part of what that shows us is that tourism, although by itself you may or may not find it interesting, it's a window to 1,000 other things that I think you should find interesting. Tourism is a window to how we think about nature, right? How we think about animals, what we think is land and wild animals, right? Because I can literally look out my window here and see moose all the time and bald eagles. But when is it wilderness, right? When does it magically become wild space? And what does that say about how we think about humans and our place in nature and our dualisms? I think will come up to several times. Tourism is a window onto how we think about identity, right? When people are a tourism spot, we engage in presenting ourselves to others, as in this bus from Denton, Texas, where it says Dentoning, right? So part of tourism is sort of how we present ourselves to others. And when you look at how a community presents itself to visitors, you learn a lot about, A, what that community thinks matters to other people, right? As the example of Maasai tourism that we'll talk about in a minute, but also what that tourism community, that tourism town or village thinks is important about them, what is unique about them, what is defining about them, their sense of identity vis-a-vis themselves and others, processes of identity formation and group separations, othering. When we talk about tourism, we talk about heritage and history and how we remember history, as with this example of a beaver den that was in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge headquarters, but is part of a broader exhibit where they talk about all sorts of things with traditional Dena'ina culture here in this space. So tourism is connected to these ideas of history and what parts of our history we emphasize and what parts we don't, as I'm trying to show with this Iditarod historical marker, which brings us to another point, that tourism is connected to colonialism and to power, and to why certain groups of people ended up controlling certain kinds of spaces. Tourism is a window onto culture change, as is with this example here of a Navajo themed skateboard that a Navajo artist did, right? Clearly an example of culture both staying the same and changing drastically. Tourism is a window onto religion and spirituality, right? With pilgrimage being something that I've studied a lot, and that is of course one of the major roots of what we now think of as tourism. So tourism is a window into all sorts of different things that I think are very interesting and that I hope you do too. I think there's something here for everybody. In this class, for example, we'll talk pretty soon about how fieldwork, this thing we do as anthropologists where we go spend time in a community, how that itself is a form of travel, of course, and about what we experience when we do that, as far as things like culture shock and being reflexive, and what that says more generally about when a person from one culture encounters that of another, both in the short term, but as ethnographers, often in the very long term. We'll talk about tourism and traveling and the effect on the environment, which will go in a lot of different directions. We'll talk about ecotourism and how that's tied in with economic development and groups that are trying to preserve their lands by inviting tourists rather than sort of cutting them down, and the promise and perils of that. We'll talk about things like sports fishing and hunting that so profoundly shape Alaska. We'll talk about things like zoos, which is itself can be a form of sort of environment tourism, and where's that dividing line of nature or not natural, and what sort of ethical issues might that raise. We'll talk a lot about cultural tourism and cultures in general, and the issue when people go to another place, for example, to experience Alaska Native culture, Maasai culture, whatever it is they're identifying as the culture of that space, and questions that raises for how we think about culture, right? Because it's complex. When people are presenting a culture, what then is culture? And also, what is culture when other people are representing it? And what is authentic culture? And is that a meaningful term? We'll talk about heritage, right? And we will talk about heritage, this concept of presenting the past and and how that ties in with archaeology, right? And the ways that we think about the past versus the way we sometimes present them to the public, and how we can get the public to truly care about the past, but also to do so in a way that doesn't damage the past, right? And all of the complexities of that. That'll also get us into issues like colonialism and decolonization, and what it means to present the past in a way that honors the full complexity of the past, as well as the painful parts of the past. And also, we'll talk about things like imagined communities, basically how we think of ourselves as connected to our ancestors, sometimes in very direct ways, and sometimes in ways that are more fleeting and tangential. We'll talk about religion and spirituality, as well as concepts of personhood and identity, and who counts as a person. Do spirits at a shrine count as persons? We'll talk about recreational tourism, things like theme parks, right? And that's the one where you're like, okay, now we're talking about a kind of tourism that's just straightforward, that's just for fun. Nay, nay. We'll talk about things like globalization, localization, Americanization that get raised when we do these things called theme parks and other sorts of just for fun tourism. As we do so, one of the things that we'll see that I think might be of particular interest to you based on your assignment ones, and is of interest, I think, in an anthropology class, where about easily half the people are anthropology majors, is this idea of receiving and host cultures and visitors, the effects of tourism on cultures. Many communities across the world receive tourists. What effect does that have on them? One of the most famous examples is very popular tourist visits to Maasai villages in Kenya, some of which are staged, not actual villages, and some of which are actual villages. There's a great article about that by Vanessa Wijngaarden, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but she talks about her fieldwork in Maasai areas, and she says Maasai fear that the tourists may be interested only in their cultural otherness. She says, Maasai fear the tourists may be interested only in their cultural otherness and consider them not as people, but as a spectacle. A clear example is when Eliamani runs behind the house to flee from the tourist camera's gaze because she fears the visitors are ridiculing her. It's a really powerful piece. You should definitely read it. And I think I actually have you read it later in the semester. But the ways in which people both need the cash and from the cash and use that as part of their participation in the economy, but at the same time have to deal with sort of the complexities and sometimes out and out challenges of being sort of othered for tourism, right? On the one hand, it can feel rewarding to share one's culture with others. On the other hand, it can feel very like, are you treating me like I am a quote savage, right? Some sort of curiosity. And so that can be an encounter that's very fraught with complexity and can sometimes have both positive and really negative impacts on the people involved. As she points out, people are able to imagine themselves in other shoes and create an image of how they may be seen, right? As you invite somebody into your community, suddenly you start to think in a way maybe you haven't always before about what face you're presenting to outsiders. Of course, we always have visitors from other places, but when you have visitors from places that are completely different than your own and have never seen your culture, or people from across the world, it starts to really get you thinking about your own identity. And that itself has a cultural impact. So there are cultural impacts of tourism on the culture, on the visitors, right? And I would say both positive and negative impacts. People can walk away from a tourist trip understanding much better their fellow human beings, which can be a really good and promising thing for the future of our world. They can also walk away from that encounter with a very simplified and stereotyped view of those other cultures, which is something I have definitely seen sometimes teaching anthropology. People that think because they spend a little bit of time in visiting a place, that they now sort of can speak for, fully understand that place, which is just not the case. So it can have both positive and negative effects, both on the people doing the tourism and the people receiving the tourists. And of course, on all of us, right? Tourism also has big economic as well as environmental impacts. For example, here in Alaska, it's our second largest private employer, non-government employer. 1 in 8 jobs in Alaska is somehow related to the tourism industry, which probably shocks none of you, especially if you live in places like Kenai or Juneau, or to some degree Anchorage as well, and as well as other places, Utqiagvik, Bethel. So it accounts for $2.5 billion, $2.5 billion in our economy. It is about, not just for Alaska, although we certainly are a state where tourism runs big, but about 10% of the global GDP is related to the tourism industry. We spend a lot of money as human beings, a lot of our resources, approximately 1/10 of our resources, traveling to see other places. It's about 1 in 10 jobs globally, at least according to the UN, but what do they know? At the same time, it's got big environmental impacts, sometimes not as big as people think. People sometimes overestimate the environmental impacts, but it does definitely have big environmental impacts, especially at the micro level. And what I mean by that is, if you look macro level, we could say, for example, the amount of water used sounds like a lot, 1.3 billion for tourism, but that's about 0.1% of the total. It doesn't sound too huge, especially when it's so much of the GDP. But when you consider local locations, the amount of water it takes, for example, for golf courses in Bora Bora, or for resorts in Bora Bora, which somebody brought up in their assignment one, is a great example of this, right? The profound amount of water that people can be taking for something like a golf course or swimming pools or fountains, right? So although at the macro level, it may not seem like a big environmental effect, at the micro level, it can be pretty transformative, majorly transformative, including just the land converted into a resort rather to whatever it was to begin with. Um, Tourism accounts allegedly for about 5% of global greenhouse gases. I said allegedly not because I think that this is a bad study by Pan et al., but just because it would be hard to 100% measure. But this is a good estimate, 5% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So not a small amount, right? And so tourism can be a thing that has definitely a lot of environmental impacts, positive economic impacts, as well as sometimes negative economic impacts as well. And we'll talk about that, including things like communities becoming too dependent on tourism and how that market can sometimes crash, as we saw with COVID. By the way, this is shows the total contribution of travel to the GDP of given countries. And so as you can see, in some places, it's quite large, particularly in the Asia and Pacific region. All right, so that's a little bit about kind of my point that tourism then is like a lens to so many different issues. So I want to, as I'm talking about things like impacts, I want to point out that I don't want to be like Michael Scott here, right? If I can get them depressed, then I'll have done my job. I don't want to only talk about negative impacts of tourism. I think tourism can be a transformative, powerful thing that can help people connect better with other human beings, see our shared humanity, see our differences, understand different kinds of landscapes, and ultimately be better human beings as a result. Tourism can also be incredibly impactful, lead to environmental issues, lead to social and cultural issues, and all sorts of negative effects on host communities. It can be both. And so we're going to talk about some things that are depressing. We're going to talk about some things that are hopeful. And overall, we're going to try to understand tourism as fitting within this broader picture of land and culture and how human beings relate to each other. Why do we travel? When we do, what do we experience? What is the host community experience? But as you know, but not just tourism as an end to itself, but kind of as we'll be touching on much bigger ideas that I think apply to all sorts of anthropologists and social scientists and scholars and really anybody that works with human beings, such as what really is culture? What really is identity? How do we live well on the land? How do we make places meaningful?